Hi, everyone. Today, I am speaking to two guests, to Dr. Victoria Avery, Keeper of Applied Arts at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, and Dr. Melissa Calaresu, Neil McKendrick Lecturer in History at Gonville and Keys College, Cambridge. And I'm speaking to Vicky and Melissa because they've worked together on two major exhibitions at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge and their associated events and publications. Those two exhibitions are first Treasured Possessions from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment, co-curated with Mary Lavin and Olinka Rublak, and most recently, Feast and Fast, The Art of Food in Early Modern Europe, with Ivan Day as a historical food consultant, which I was lucky enough to visit just last year. So Melissa and Vicky, I'd like to start, if I can, with just a little introduction from each of you. If you could give us a sense of your current roles and maybe your research background as well. Melissa, we might start with you.
Okay, sure. Thank you. As you know, I'm an early modern European historian, and I started off as a historian of political thought. And I always tell this story because I think it is interesting to think just the way in which our interests evolve. I started off as a historian of political thought. I had no real kind of engagement with anything other than two-dimensional sort of evidence, so to speak. And over the years, partly because of teaching, partly probably mostly because of teaching, I got involved more with material culture. I had always used the Fitzwilliam Museum as a way of teaching, but it was really in this third year course that I did with Mary Lavin and Olinka Rublak, and Vicky Avery at the time was really helpful and generous in allowing us with the students into the museum. And really out of that, then I became much more interested in material culture and material culture of the street and the material culture of food.
That's fantastic. And Vicky?
Originally, I suppose my first love really is Italian Renaissance sculpture. And I started off my career actually as an associate professor in the History of Art department at Warwick University. I was incredibly happy there and had a wonderful autumn term every year, taking out the entire cohort of students to Venice. I did that for sort of 5 or so years, but then I had a real yearning to expand beyond just art history teaching and to broaden out beyond sculpture. And so I became the keeper of the Applied Arts Department, which is a wonderful mishmash of three-dimensional post-classical objects from sculpture, but also, arms and armor, furniture, clocks, watches, jewelry, textiles, glass, silver, ceramics, you name it, are us. And also much, much broader teaching, not only of Cambridge University students, art history, but also material culture historians, but also theologians and classicists and modern linguists, but also from other HEIs, but also the broader public as well. So I've really enjoyed really expanding out from quite a niche subject to, am I, Jill of all trades and, master of none, I don't know, but anyway.
I really think that's something that's so interesting in this conversation, as well as the fact that you bring those different backgrounds and different kinds of experiences together, and you bring them to the exhibitions that you've created. Melissa, I wondered if you could give us a little bit of background on how the two of you came to work together. So you mentioned kind of getting to know each other through that kind of teaching. How did that progress then to conversations about putting together large-scale exhibitions of the kind you've done?
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, really, the generosity of the Fitzwilliam Museum, I have to say, because one, they allowed us in with the students, allowed us to touch what are pretty valuable objects, important objects. And it really transformed the way not only we taught, but also the way I do my research. And Vicky was kind of up for trying to engage in a kind of broader way, bringing in the scholarship that we brought in with our own specific, particular treasure possessions to start off with, the history of dress, history of religion, history of food, and bring our expertise into an exhibition which used this amazing collection of early modern objects.
I remember showing up to see Treasured Possessions the first time and just being absolutely blown away. And the book, the Treasured Possessions catalog, is one I still use constantly in teaching. So it's one that really, really grabbed me. I suppose that then brings us to the questions. And Vicky, I want to turn to you on these. Now, this is the biggest possible question. I'm conscious, okay, it's multiple small questions, let's say, but I wanted to ask about the process of creating an exhibition, because in these videos, part of the idea is that perhaps scholars who work with material or visual culture but have no understanding of the or no experience of the museum side of things might have a lot of questions about how you actually go about putting together an exhibition, from say the concept and pitching through to developing collaborations and then opening the doors. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about the process of putting an exhibition together.
Sure, of course, I'll try my best. It is a very, very broad question, of course. I mean, one thing I think I should say, since we are sadly in the third lockdown, is that I think we all have to think quite hard now about what an exhibition really is. And actually, many academics have great projects that, while we will be obviously talking about the physical exhibition with real live objects and visitors coming into the museum to encounter those objects in particular groupings and so on, actually there are other ways of putting on exhibitions, and I think the digital is actually becoming very, very exciting indeed. It's not just a sort of an elaborated PowerPoint now, but you've actually got sort of three-dimensional objects. You can zoom into things. So I do think that some ideas may actually be better played out in perhaps a digital format, or indeed perhaps a series of seminars or a conference, or indeed perhaps text. But since we are talking about physical exhibitions, I think one thing to think very, very hard about, and this is particularly for maybe people who are naturally less visually tuned in to start off with, is that academics are often thinking about their arguments in terms of a text, but actually with an exhibition you have to slightly flip it on its head and think about the objects, because it's not a text-based thing often, and we might get criticised for writing slightly overlong labels or whatever. People want to come and engage with the objects, so that has to be your starting point. You've got to come up with a sort of an argument or a series of questions that you feel that the public need to be engaged with and to find some answers. Often, I think with early modern material, it's quite hard to get the general public to engage with it. So often, for example, with Feast and Fast, our most recent collaboration, we started with a here and now and asked, a series of questions about food and its relevance to today. And then we sort of posed it saying, well, actually, many of these concerns and issues actually have their roots or parallels, if you like, in the early modern period. And so in a way, we invited the public to come back on a journey through history with us to look at some of these concerns or issues through objects, through juxtaposition. Sometimes it might have been a single object, sometimes it might have been a group of objects, and then actually sort of lead people through this discussion, then almost bring them back to where they started, back to the present day, in the hope that actually by the time they've looked at 300 plus objects, they've gone on a journey that has led them to really think very, very hard about present day concerns, but through historical objects. So, it really is thinking hard about the questions. What is it that you want people to grapple with, to really engage quite deeply with? And what are the best objects to do that? Sometimes, as I say, it might be choosing one or two objects. Sometimes, as dear Melissa knows, it's about massing of objects, because sometimes having a great number of similar objects together can create a very, very great visual impact. Sometimes it's recreating particular scenarios, like, for example, with Ivan Day and the food exhibition, we did 3 historical recreations where we put genuine artifacts, historical objects with recreated food to give it back a sort of a context so people could really understand, as if they'd gone into a sort of a time machine, the sorts of displays they would have seen. But I think for me, a really key point is making objects come alive. Often in a non-exhibition context, museum objects can be in old displays, old-fashioned displays, slightly boring, just lined up objects in a case, and they're quite hard to engage with. So I think for me, the benefit perhaps of an exhibition and working with people like Melissa who are engaging in cutting edge research is how can you convert those objects into something which is visually stunning that will remain with people once they've left the exhibition, and hopefully come back again, tell their friends and spread the word, but actually have a real sort of impact on their brain, so that actually if they go around a supermarket and they see a pineapple being sold for 75p, they actually question the ethics of this and how this can be.
I think it's really fascinating to get a sense of that thought process, both around the concept and around the kind of the collecting or curation of items as well. I want to come in just a moment to what you mentioned about the cutting edge research side. But before we do that, I wondered if I can ask a bit about process. So I remember, Melissa, from conversations going back certainly to 2016 and probably before, that this was an exhibition, thinking here about Feast and Fast, that was in the works for a very long period of time. And it's clear that this is a labor of years, not kind of months or weeks. I wondered if either of you wanted to say a little bit about the steps in that process, because that's something that might be a little opaque to people who aren't familiar with it. So what actually happens between the concept being approved and those decisions being made and the opening of the exhibition?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we probably both can say something because there's quite a lot that we did. I mean, I think we met regularly. I think that's really important. We spent a lot of time looking online, what was available, and also in the stores. There was a lot of just kind of massing together all kinds of different objects, knowing the argument already, but actually also kind of seeing whether we can do things with the objects. So the objects in some ways were leading us, I mean, in certain directions. I mean, Vicky will remember this, but I was quite keen on sauce boats for a very long time. And they stayed until pretty close to the end of the cut. But there is a really interesting collection of sauce boats which we could have used in the exhibition, but got cut. So it's a really process of looking through not only the decorative arts collection, but we looked in prints. We looked in the painting collection as well. And we also looked for objects or images that we thought we needed to tell the story that weren't in the Fitzwilliam. In fact, we had very few objects from outside of the Fitzwilliam collection. And in fact, the exhibition did a great job of really highlighting what the real treasures in the Fitzwilliam Museum. But occasionally we had to go outside of that. And that was happening almost up to the very end of the process of selecting. I don't know if you remember, Vicky, we found that painting in Birmingham, for instance, which we got, which was wonderful. So there's this kind of throwing out your net really widely, and then spending a lot of time winnowing it down. And the winnowing down would be because there's not enough space. I mean, Vicky will know about it literally in the case, but also that something's not in good condition or can't be shown or can't be displayed, or you have to get something. Then there was, of course, a lot of cleaning up things, getting things ready for a display as well. That takes quite a long time as well. And even in that process, some of the object kind of fell off or left the exhibition, so to speak. So it's a really long process of talking to each other, meeting really regularly, and then slowly winnowing it down. I mean, alongside that process is the process of making the catalogue. So the catalogue and the exhibition are kind of being worked alongside each other. And that, in fact, is a whole other process. But I'll leave it now to Vicky to say more.
That's absolutely right. And in fact, that was where I learned so much from Melissa and her expertise. But in a way, sometimes they look actually, the broken, the discarded object is actually very interesting for telling a particular story, even if visually it's very unappealing. Sometimes actually you really do want a big, spectacular, showy object that will really grab somebody's attention. So we had some quite interesting discussions about that. And, you know, I would occasionally advise Melissa, look, actually, although this object is really interesting, I think it might be better for, you know, perhaps discussion in the catalogue, or perhaps this group of objects, they could make an interesting section perhaps on the website. So not all objects are equal in terms of their impact or their use in the exhibition. So alongside absolutely consulting with Melissa as the co-curator and also Ivan Day, there was also quite a lot of discussion with other expert colleagues in the field saying, you know, actually we've got these 3 objects, we've whittled it down to this, what do you all reckon and why? And also engaging some of Melissa's material cultural students. We think it's very important to get a diversification of voice. So actually some of the students were asked to write you know, particular case studies, for example, but also working with our very experienced learning team, particularly, you know, curatorial practice, best practice in museums has moved on a lot, really in the last sort of decade. So some of the ideas we were doing with treasure possessions were pretty radical at the time, and now we look back and they look actually rather traditional. And with Feast and Fast, again, we tried to do more co-production, co-curation with target audiences. So we were working with some selected groups that the learning team have long-standing associations with, and we wanted to bring in a diversification of voice. It wasn't just curatorial or expert voices, it was actually bringing in sort of day-to-day experiences of others. So we actually did a lot of work with a number of communities. They were perhaps seniors from a particular movement and dance group who come in, who live in sheltered housing. There was a group of young pupils from the museum's ambassador group who came in, and also some learning disabled adults who do work regularly with our collection. So all their different voices were also listened hard to, and they helped us very much then develop the sort of interpretation of the objects. We did a community film that was funded by the university so that the general public could also listen to diverse voices and opinions as well. And then just literally some of the practicalities with the show. Then obviously there's a lot of photography work of post-conserved objects. We worked very much with the exhibition manager, brilliant David Evans. We actually brought in some designers to help us with the build, lighting designers to think very carefully about the low light required from a conservation point of view, but yet to make the objects to sing and be very dramatic. We talked to security about the safety of objects. Again, we brought in learning colleagues about the height at which objects might better be seen by visitors in wheelchairs or children. So I think really one of the problems for some academics, I mean, not for Melissa, who is the most truly collaborative person I know, but a lot of academics often work in isolation. They can write a book pretty much by themselves, shove it in, and they don't really have to listen to other people. But actually, the museum, which is why one of the reasons I left academia, because I wanted to actually really work alongside other creative people. You really have to listen up to your colleagues and to your visitors and understand what they want, and then try your best to deliver it. And sometimes it's frustrating because the curatorial voice is almost the least loud heard bark in the kennel. But actually, I think often it's much better. The end result is better from this genuine, authentic collaboration.
I think it's so great to hear about, these huge teams, as you say, everyone from kind of lighting to security, but also that conversational aspect. And that's something that I remember really well from Feast and Fast, where the ways that those voices of different audiences and different groups came through alongside kind of curatorial voices. I thought it was really fantastic. I wanted to come back to that point about engaging with research, because obviously one of the issues that people often run into is that they, curators and the scholars who work with them often find themselves bringing together the latest scholarly ideas and then having to boil them down to the size of a label, for instance, or you might have the luxury of a longer catalogue entry if you're very, very lucky. But I wondered, Melissa, I might turn to you to start us off here, to think how was that experience of bringing scholarship to bear, or kind of making scholarship accessible in the kind of museum context?
Okay, sorry, I'm laughing because Vicky and I had a lot of problems in cutting down the label. We're not good. I don't think we qualify as good curatorial practice. I think it was 50 words that we have to keep the label down to, and I think
75, but it's hard.
Around 100. And yeah, so it is a problem. It is a problem. I mean, Vicky and I wrote the labels together, and we tried to write them in a way that was engaging, but we were both attached to the stories behind the objects and to the kind of important detail. I think we did get feedback, positive feedback about the labels. Certainly anecdotally, people would say to me, thank you so much, because I really learned a lot in looking at the label. I mean, I'm an avid label reader. I know that there is a curatorial school which suggests that you shouldn't have labels, they should just be the objects and then somehow you engage with them. But, I'm a historian and I want to know kind of where it comes from and what it means and the context behind it. So it is difficult. I think that we tried in terms of the kind of rhetoric to make it really engaging. I think we really thought about carefully about the words that we're using. I mean, I think probably both of us are probably love a little bit too much alliteration, but we did think about it all the time. But it is hard, and I mean, Vicky will tell you much more about what's expected in a museum and what what's meant to be there. But it is a very it makes you a better writer. Absolutely makes you a better writer. Writing a catalog makes you a better writer because you have to be more efficient and more effective with the words that you've got. I mean, I think that, as an academic, we're a little bit probably too self-indulgent in the way that we write and the kind of circles that we weave in our arguments, when in fact, you need to be pretty clear about what you're trying to do in an exhibition if you've only got 50 or 100 words.
Absolutely. I wondered, Vicky, because your background, obviously, you've got a deep scholarly background and this kind of long experience of working in museums and curation. Is that something that you feel you run up against constantly in creating exhibitions of this kind, kind of bringing that scholarship to bear on the choices and the way that you display them?
Yes, I mean, absolutely, as Melissa eloquently put, I mean, it's always very, very tough nut to crack. And I'm not sure we always get it right. But I think one thing I would say that the challenge is it's not dumbing down, it's making things explicable. And one may have a slight query or contest the fact that there are museological good practice guidelines that say, for example, that in order to make the didactic material as accessible and engaging as possible to all audiences, you should aim to write it for sort of an intelligent, perhaps 13-year-old. So then, of course, you think, well, what's an intelligent 13-year-old? And not all 13-year-olds are equally intelligent and whatever. But I think that's really kind of slightly missing the point. I think that actually, if you write clearly and you don't use jargon words, and I think that's quite hard sometimes for historians and the problem is, of course, there's a perfectly good, if you use the known jargon, it shortens your labels. But then if you're using a word that actually very, very few people understand, sometimes you have to think, look, maybe I have to change the angle of this label, or actually, what's the most important thing that I want the person to take away from looking at this particular object? And perhaps what we were trying to do with some of our labels was actually pose some questions. So the idea of the label is that you look at the object first and then you kind of go, I don't know what that is, and you read the label, or you read the label and it makes you want to look back at the object. And then the label is supposed to sort of spark some thoughts independent in your own mind. You go, do I agree with that? Is that really true? And then you look back at the object. So if you get the viewer to look back at the object having read a label, then I think you've succeeded. But yeah, I mean, there are these, it's about tone, it's about pitch, it's about content. And of course, some visitors might want to know very much about how something was made. Some people might want to know whom it was made for or who made it. Some people want to might want to know about the provenance and about the history. How did it come into the museum, or why is it broken, or why does it look the way it does? You can't do it all. So I think you have to think, as I say, what is the one question or the two questions that you've chosen an object and you placed it in a particular setting to make a particular point. So the label has to amplify that particular point as much as you can. And then you've got other platforms like lectures or like the website or perhaps an audio guide. We didn't particularly have one, but I think they have their place to explicate out further.
I think that multimedia factor, as well as you say that you've got maybe extra items on the website or more detail in the catalogue, is something that's, I think, really, really important to think through. I wanted to ask a bit more about the practical side before we kind of come back to some of the bigger issues, because obviously this is an immense practical undertaking for everyone involved. And Vicky, you kind of mentioned a few of these things earlier on, from security and borrowing, and maybe there are kind of questions of insurance and long-range planning and reciprocal arrangements with other places and so forth. Now, it's too much to ask both of you to tell us absolutely everything about the practical concerns, but I wondered if you might each reflect for a moment on some of the practical considerations in mounting an exhibition like this that might not be immediately apparent to someone who hasn't done it before. What should people be conscious is going to come up potentially? I don't know, Melissa, if you'd like to reflect on that at all.
Gosh, there's so many things. I mean, I think the first one is just being able to access objects, and being able to see them, and ideally touch them. And that's not always easy. Vicky knows her collection very well, and she's got some great colleagues who are also were pretty amenable. I mean, I think one of the things that's important to remember is that exhibitions like this do require a lot of expertise, and not even behind the scenes, just straight expertise. And you've got to get to know people in a museum. You've got to make relationships with them. And out of those relationships, then you'll get, kind of generosity back. And I think that's the thing that it's I guess it's more about collaboration, but it's also about the practical aspect that you need to kind of engage with the people who know about the objects, before you can even start thinking that you might be able to get into the museum and use them and handle them, get your students to look at them. So I think that practical thing about knowing a collection well and knowing the people in the collection, I think was one of the most important things. I mean, there are other things like size and things like that. Some, I think, was a little bit unrealistic sometimes, or we were sometimes, about what we wanted to include. We did include a very big painting in the end, but I mean, there were lots of objects where we thought, I don't know, Vicky, if you remember, at one point we did a lot of work with the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, and we were hoping to do something collaborative with them. And that this enormous, beautiful, do you remember, cauldron, early modern cauldron, which would have had to be hung up, and it was really complicated. We also wanted to put in a wall of spoons, which I think still is a really great idea, of different spoons from sort of around the world, the sort of universal spoon wall. And it was just too complicated. I mean, I think one of the things Vicky will probably say is the other thing that stops a lot of ideas from going very far forward is money. I mean, just, having the money and the time to do something.
So fascinated by the spoon wall, but Vicky, I want to throw to you before I get carried away by that.
But I think really it is always a capacity issue that I'm afraid even in well-funded museums such as university museums like the Fitzwilliam and the other University of Cambridge museums, there is a lack of staff time, and we understand how important exhibitions are for generating new thought, showcasing the cutting edge research of collaborators in the museum. This is why we do it, but it does go alongside our normal everyday life of permanent galleries, new acquisitions, new policies, dealing with public requests, so on. It's just yet another thing. So some museums, I'm afraid, just simply don't have the staff time to do it. The other thing I would say is that exhibitions, if you really want them to be deep and rich and transformative and have a decent catalogue and a decent website and a decent public programme, they take a hell of a lot of time. And I mean, normally an exhibition from start to finish, we tend to work on overly tight timeframes because the museum is a tight ship, and because we are quite small, actually we can be fleet of foot. So normally it's about a 3-year turnaround time, but actually it would be more comfortable, and the bigger the nationals, normally it's a 5-year turnaround time. So if one's thinking about funding applications and actually getting research out, perhaps for the ref or whatever, you do have to be aware. You can't just go, oh, I want to get this up in 6 months' time. I think a lot of academics come in with utterly unrealistic expectations about what can be done in the time. But also, if you need to make an object selection, and one reason we it was really feast and fast because of financial considerations, because of we were in the moment of Brexit uncertainty, and despite every effort by our brilliant development team, and Melissa and I working very closely together, we were not very successful in gaining funding. We knew that the exhibition would be a runaway success, which it was, and it was critically acclaimed and so on. But I mean, try as we would to get funding up in advance, it was not going to be possible. That's one of the reasons why we decided to turn a problem into an advantage. So we would have had more international, more national loans. We thought, well, actually, we were sitting on these wonderful collections here in Cambridge. So let's absolutely emphasise what we've got locally, so you don't have great big transportation costs and insurance costs and so on. But then, of course, as Melissa says, getting access to those objects, and sometimes they need they need conservation work, and that needs to be funded, and you need the time to do it. They need the time to do the post-conservation photography work for the catalogue. Most publishers want a 9-month time lag between when you submit the final catalogue to when it gets out. And as Melissa knows, that the problem with an exhibition catalogue, it cannot be pushed back. It has to be there for the opening, the vernissage. You know, you can't have the opening without the kind of, you know, if an academic book, the schedule gets pushed back by 6 months, so what? If the catalogue doesn't get produced and published on time, then the exhibition is shut and you've got left with 1,000 copies of a redundant catalogue. So, you know, timing is very important, and fundraising as well.
I think it's so good to reflect a little on the practical concerns of time and money, because I think these are things that people need to know going in. But also, I'm conscious that, you know, this last year in particular, perhaps we're living in a time of very tightened budgets anyway. But I'm very conscious of how difficult a year it's been for people in the museum sector and heritage sector, and more broadly. But I wanted to build, Vicky, on what you've said there about catalogues, and think about some of the other things that come out of exhibitions of this kind. So there are catalogues like the wonderful ones that you've put together for Treasured Possessions and for Feast and Fast. There are also, I think I'm right in saying, there have been international conferences, there have been lectures, there have been events, there have been other publications. I wondered if you kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the process of creating those kind of lasting contributions, whether they be events or publications coming from these major exhibitions.
Sure. I mean, Melissa is probably even better placed than me to talk about some of this, but I think really the whole point of having this additional package of activity, whether it's face-to-face verbal lectures or conferences or academic papers or the website, is that the exhibition is obviously a finite thing, and you hope that you will have a good footfall, and that a lot of the public will come, they'll read reviews and word of mouth, and they'll comment. But we are also absolutely realistically aware that you know, most exhibitions are put on for 3 months, and that's really because the standard loan length of incoming loans is 3 months, because museums don't want to let their treasures go for more than, so that's the absolute standard time, because you've got a month to from when it's created up, brought over and installed, and then you've got to deinstall it. So it's about a 5-month absence of that particular loan object from the lending museum. So you've only got your exhibition for 3 months, and you've killed yourself to get this exhibition up for 3 months. And you are aware that people will come in numbers. You know, we were very pleased with our numbers for something like 65,000 people, which is actually very, very good, especially that we're not a London-based museum, and getting tourists and visitors away from the metropolis to the provinces is actually very, very, very difficult indeed. Mm-hmm. But you know, you have to have longer reaching output to really justify the expense. So this is why you have the publication and why you have the website. Of course, in the olden days, you would have literally the catalogue and the exhibition, but of course, the website is a great equalizer, it's a great democratizer, because it's free for anybody who's got a computer worldwide, available 24/7, and you can show things on it that you would never be able to show in the exhibition. You can have a multiplicity of voices and so on. So all we try and do in the let's say the add-ons to the exhibition is to make it as engaging, as meaningful, as relevant to as broad a possible public, knowing that certain platforms will be more appropriate for some people than others. So you might have a very intellectual, if you like, conference. So we had our wonderful from Columbus to Del Monte crash funded pineapple conference. That really was intended for academics and interested sort of intelligent lay public. But then we had family events with sort of pineapple sherbet tasting and sort of you know, wonderful pineapple scented mist going off and everything. So I think whatever you do, you're trying to make a legacy, long-lasting changes, and that people, if they miss the exhibition, they can go back and somehow experience it through a combination of print and digital.
That's fantastic. Melissa, you're
Yeah, I'd like to just say something because I think one of the advantages of doing an exhibition is you have to think so far in the future. So that meant it actually was quite easy for us to think about when we were going to have our conference. We actually got a special issue of a journal out of 2 workshops, which we planned actually 2 and 3 years, I think, before the exhibition. So those workshops were planned, and then out of it came 4 articles, which we then published as a special issue. We knew that we wanted to do something on the pineapple, and so we put in our applications relatively early for funding. So I think that was pretty seamless, actually. I thought that worked really well because the research came, like the kind of some of the research questions that came out of our discussions then eventually fed in. It wasn't just my, our own research that went into the exhibition and came out the other side, but actually the process of putting together the exhibition together created new research questions.
That's really, that actually leads me on to kind of the last topic that I wanted to talk to both of you about. And that's the way that, we've talked about research informing the decisions that go into the creation of an exhibition. But I wondered a bit more about what this collaboration means for your own approach to research. For, Melissa, whether these experiences have changed how you write or how you think in your own work. But also, Vicky, thinking about how collaborations like this help to kind of emphasize the research potential of objects or kind of approach things anew. Melissa, I don't know if you want to start off on that.
I mean, I've said a little bit about the way in which kind of material culture has become much more part of my research. I mean, I'm definitely a faster and better writer because of the exhibition. There's nothing quite like having to produce 50 labels over a weekend. I mean, this is the world that Vicky lives in, basically. I think for academics, we're used to rushing a lecture, but the things that we write, we kind of spend too much time on, probably. I guess it must feel a little bit like what it's like to be a journalist in some ways. You have to be quick and fast and get things out. So that was really enjoyable and really stressful. But it has made me a better, more effective writer. I mean, in terms of my research, I mean, I'm not thinking that everything I do is going to become an exhibition, because I think they are quite unique opportunities, and not every research question is a natural kind of exhibition topic. But I do think about public engagement much more. I mean, one of the things that we haven't really spoken about much is just how much time we spent thinking about the public engagement programs. So Vicky's mentioned these groups, community groups, but we spent a lot of time thinking about the calendar, what we could do in different times of the year, how we could kind of make some certain ideas particularly interesting, like, fasting, for instance. How do you make fasting a kind of interesting topic for a kind of general public? Not obvious, right? But then you start thinking about dieting and about bodies, and before you knew it, we had all kinds of really great ideas. And we did a lot of brainstorming, and not all of those things kind of came through. So I think that when I write now, when I'm thinking about now, I do think kind of much more about public engagement. I'm also being asked probably more now to do public lectures in a way I didn't before. So I do try and think about how could I make this more interesting. I mean, I think one of the other things I would say is that we live in bubbles, academics, and Vicky doesn't, I think, in a way that I think is really healthy. I mean, you have to try and make, I don't know, the complexity of certain kind of Christian ideas or Jewish ideas in relation to food, eating, kind of accessible to a wider world. And that's a really interesting kind of thing to have to do, challenge to do as a historian.
Yeah, Vicky, I don't know if you've some thoughts on that.
Well, for me, again, it was interesting dealing with a topic such as food. Was very, very broad indeed, and thinking, on the other hand, everybody's invested in it because everybody feels that they either love it or they hate it. They like cooking, they grow their own vegetables, whatever. So this was, for me, an exhibition that had huge potential for really going on a journey with people and actually hopefully transforming by the end. So you had 3 rooms, you've got 300 objects. You had this sort of text from these very, very big statements, sort of introductory panels to sections, to sort of slightly smaller, like you're sort of drilling down different layers to these very, very detailed object text. And actually, we did also, I mean, one thing might be worth saying, which does now feed into my sort of thinking afterwards, we did a lot of impact study work where we actually employed somebody to do a lot of audience engagement kind of tracking, because we need to know what works, what doesn't work. They would have sort of people anonymously just watching visitors, where do they stand, how long do dwelling time, and they do thermal maps around the show. So we'd all want our areas to be lovely bright red, or orange was okay, but the sad blue, cold, neglected, frozen areas, not good enough. You know, what is the public looking at? Are they looking more at the objects? Are they looking at more at the labels? Are they looking at more at the brightly coloured objects, or the smaller things? Or do they like the objects that are on open display, like Ivan Day's food recreations, rather than is there somehow a psychological barrier by putting things in cases? We also did an experimental kind of creative zone at the end, where we had hoped to do more multi-sensory activities, but again, that had to be limited for various reasons. In fact, in the end, due to COVID, a lot of the stuff that we'd had out that people could touch and smell got absolutely taken away anyway. But for me, the constant challenge, I think, moving on was I loved how we did co-curation. I loved the community films. We actually got a second film because the university very much liked the first film. They wanted to then follow up and find out what the impact was on those community groups having been involved. So they gave us more money to do a follow-up film, which was absolutely fascinating and heartwarming to see actually how people had transformative experience and how they articulated those out. So I think for me, moving on, is learning from these quite daring displays on open access, if you like, the digital end of things. Our head of IT made a most beautiful website that I really would recommend everybody look at. So how does one build on successes, and how does one build on things that didn't work so well, and carry on, I think, really maxing out on the digital and maxing out on the co-creation with different communities? That for me is the big take home.
It's so interesting that, you know, we might think about curation as a form of public engagement, but of course then here you see that there's all of these other offshoots and all of these different varieties of engagement that are wrapped up in the events, in the texts, in the kinds of outreach, and even in the kind of the art and film that's being created as a result of it. That's really wonderful. Vicky, Melissa, I just want to thank you both so much, both for curating a marvelous exhibition in Feast and Fast and another beloved exhibition in Treasured Possessions. But most of all, thank you so much for coming and chatting to me today. I know that people are going to find this a really, really interesting conversation to think with.
Thank you.